Hey everybody, Crystal Gamer here, and welcome to my channel and to a very special video that I am super excited about. Why, you ask? Well, it's because today's is not a run-of-the-mill video, but a story video as well. Now, a few of you may have watched my Cobweb Cafe build video. That video included a story that I called Legend of the LaCroix, and it was basically a history of the Old Victorian along with a bit of a mystery. The story in this video, called Grizelda's Quest, is the second installment in that series, and it answers the main questions raised by the Legend of LaCroix's story. Now, if you have not watched my Cobweb Cafe video, have no fear. It's not a requirement for this one. Both of the stories can stand alone, so you can listen to this independently of that one. However, I will say that I think it'll probably be much better, definitely more intriguing, if you listen to the story in that video first, because it does set up the mystery. So that said, I'll make sure to provide the link for that story in the description below if you want to head over there first before watching this one. I think you'll thank me if you do. For those of you who have watched the other one or just are sticking around now, the video that you're going to see playing while I tell the story is in several parts. It includes the making of Grizelda and Grizelda's hovel in the first part, and of course Grizelda will be introduced in the story. And the second part of the video, I can't tell you about it entirely right away, but I can tell you that it's character creation that goes with the story. Now, on to our story. Oh, and I almost forgot, I suppose. I probably should warn y'all before we get into this one. It does get a bit dark and twisted, so if you are easily disturbed, this is probably not the story for you. Okay, here we go. Grizelda's Quest. The old woman's gnarled hands slipped on the bowl. She cursed to herself. Even muddling ingredients together had become difficult, though she knew it wouldn't be for much longer. She heard something hit the front of her house. Peering through a hole in a scraggly piece of material meant to function as a curtain, she could see it was those darn village kids acting up again, throwing things at her home, her little shack that was really nothing more than a hovel. They were trying to instigate her as usual. She grumbled and let out a few more curses. On one hand, she just wished that they'd leave her be. On the other, she'd be counting on those little village kids and their misbehavior not too long from now. Still, she couldn't help but be sick of them and all the people in Forgotten Hollow nowadays. Her remote region of land had been invaded. That damn railway system put in by the LaCroix brought far too many people to what was once her private, secluded little piece of the world. Before that, things were much more quiet. She blamed Francis and Claire LaCroix entirely for destroying her peaceful life. On top of it, they were so perfect and so well-liked by everyone in the community that they irritated her to no end. She simply could not stand them. Then, on top of that, they built this monstrosity of a Victorian that was far too large for the village. It didn't belong. They didn't belong. None of them. Even with the little village's growth, she had purposely managed to keep to herself. She had her own garden out back, grew her own food, gathered her own berries and ingredients in the forest and land that surrounded her home, fished the local river in her little boat, and didn't need or want anything from any of these villagers. As it was, just having them around her was work for her. She had to use glamour spells every time she walked out of her hovel nowadays, just in case someone saw her. No one could know how old she was after all. They would think it unnatural, and they'd be right. Hell, she didn't even know her own age. At best guess, she thought she was probably around 90, and no one lived that long. People were starting to live longer in the cities nowadays, but in these remote regions, most were lucky if they made it to 50. In fact, the oldest people in the village were the LaCroix, and they were probably in their late 30s. So if people saw her true appearance, they'd think her a witch, and she'd be hanged for it. And they'd be right about that, too. She was a witch, and she'd been brewing potions to keep herself alive far longer than the average person, to keep sicknesses at bay for decades now. But the potions she'd been using were no longer effective enough. Unless she took drastic measures, her time on this earth would soon come to an end, and she knew it. It was a problem she'd been working on her whole life to solve, this problem of old age and mortality, and if anyone could figure it out, Grizelda could. People in the village may not have known who and what was living right under their noses, But they had not just the oldest, but also the most powerful witch for at least 500 miles, right there in that little village of Forgotten Hollow. Of course, there were rumors about her simply because she kept to herself, but she kept to herself to the point that no one bothered with her, except those darn kids, of course. Grizelda had quite a history of education in the art of witchcraft, too. Not only was she born with natural magical ability, but she cultivated it extensively throughout her many years. Then there was a period where she had an ongoing conflict with a dark sorcerer who almost bested her. Ultimately, an older, much more powerful witch saved her from the dark sorcerer. That witch took Grizelda under her wing and mentored her for years. The old witch managed to keep Grizelda in the light and also tried to deter her obsession with and quest for eternal life, warning her that eternal life would come with darkness, evil, and damnation. When the older witch finally passed on, she left Grizelda the rustic little shack she lived in, along with all of her books, potions, ingredients, and resources. It was a gold mine for a magic practitioner. Though Grizelda had managed to stay on the straight and narrow and keep to the light magical path while her friend lived, she never did give up her obsession with finding a cure for death, and the old witch's passing just fueled her obsession further. Grizelda read every book and went through every scrap of everything in that hovel in the decades that she lived there, always searching for the answer, the key to avoiding death. She couldn't find any solution that used light magic. That wasn't particularly surprising. Besting death was unnatural after all. Still, this mortality problem was one that she was determined to solve at any cost, even if that meant using dark magic. Buried in the old witch's things, Grizelda had found some very ancient books. Some books that had been spelled shut and that probably would have been better left shut. She knew that, but they tempted her, and there was no one to deter her from it now. Eventually, she found what she was looking for. It was a complex spell involving multiple elements and ingredients. It would not be an easy spell to cast. Most witches wouldn't have the power or ability to pull it off. Plus, the ingredients required for the potion element of the spell were very difficult to acquire. She spent years gathering them all, even having to travel far distances from Forgotten Hollow. Then there was the result to consider. The spell would not just extend her life or make her youthful, it would make her immortal. It would also revert her back to childhood. Her suspicion was that it would revert her all the way back to a nearly newborn state. She couldn't be entirely sure, but she was as certain as she could be. Because it was a dark magic spell, a part of her feared the results. Though there were many doubts, her desire to live overrode her concerns, overrode that feeling inside her telling her that what she was planning to do should never be done. So how to cast a spell that reverts you back to infancy and makes you immortal without anyone knowing? Not only that, but who's going to take care of you once you're a helpless infant? These were questions that she had to answer, and that's where the village kids came in. They played this little game about once a week where a couple of them would knock on her door and run away. She knew when they were coming. She had protection spells all around the perimeter of her property and always knew when they were crossed. But she set up the spells to allow the kids to be able to cross those boundaries on purpose. She knew those village kids would serve her purposes one day, so she didn't want to deter them from their little games, annoying as they were. Her plan was to cast the spell in such a way that she'd be an infant on the porch when the kids showed up to knock on her door and run away. She just hoped that they'd see a baby there and not run away, that they'd alert an adult of the baby's, of her, presence. She also planned to alter the protection spells to accommodate that very scenario. Years of preparation went into this, and she was beginning to get anxious. The day would soon be upon her. She looked forward to it and feared it all at the same time. There were so many things that could go wrong. She could only hope that nothing did, but she was running out of time and would have no choice but to quell her fear and get on with it soon. When the day finally came and Grizelda cast the spell, it went remarkably well. Exactly to plan, actually, and those kids came through for her exactly as she'd hoped, too. The only problem was that the adults that they alerted were the LaCroix, the people in town that she hated the most. Ultimately, in an almost cruel twist of fate, it was the LaCroix who ended up keeping her, and as a helpless infant, there was nothing she could do about that. Of course, the LaCroix were none the wiser. They had no idea that the infant was the woman that had lived in the little shack. They didn't even know that the woman hated them. The only thing they, and everyone else knew, was that the woman disappeared the same day the baby had arrived, and no one could explain it. To the LaCroix, the baby was a gift from God, the child they were never able to have themselves no matter how many times they tried. Grizelda became baby Antoinette, named after Claire Lavoie's great-grandmother. As an infant, Grizelda, now Antoinette, had no idea of her past life. Her first 5 years were mostly normal, though she didn't get along with other kids very well at all. Eventually, the day they called her 5th birthday came along. On that day, she was chasing a stray cat so that she could pull its tail and hear it screech. In chasing the cat, she came across the old hovel. Unbeknownst to Antoinette, it hadn't been touched since she left. Grizelda had cast spells to ensure that it wouldn't be, that once she, the baby, was taken by someone, visitors would feel a sense of dread any time they approached the hovel, and that no one would be able to open the door or go inside. No one except her. Antoinette had never seen the little shack before, but it intrigued her. Without even knowing it, she walked right through the spells cast on the perimeter. They had no effect on her. She had to make her way through a lot of vines and vegetation, though. The hovel was set in a bunch of growth when Grizelda lived there. Now that vegetation had taken over even more. But Antoinette was small, and she had watched cats enough to learn that being small allows you to weave your way in and out of things, and that's exactly what she did until she reached the front door. She put her ear to it, listened. She didn't hear anything, but yet she did. Something called to her, but it was internal, not a voice, but a feeling. She climbed up on a stump and tried to see through a small window. It was dark inside and there was some cloth over the window. She couldn't see much of anything. She went back to the door and tried turning the knob she could barely reach. It turned. The door creaked as she opened it and peered into the darkness. For a moment, she stood there frozen, both curious and just slightly afraid. It took a minute for her eyes to adjust. Once they did, she could see that, even to her, it was a very small place, much smaller than the Victorian she lived in. The floor was dusty, dirty really. It was very cluttered, with all sorts of things she didn't recognize filling nearly every nook and cranny from floor to ceiling. Wide-eyed, she stared at it in fascination. It was nothing like the spotless home she lived in. There were books everywhere, and also strange containers of the like she'd never seen before. She went inside. As soon as she did, a couple of mice scurried off and made her jump at their movement, but she was undeterred. Something about this old, tired place felt right to her. She started looking through things she could reach, some old containers covered in dust and books with strange symbols. It wasn't long before she noticed a small glass bottle filled with a bright red liquid. It was on a low shelf near to the floor, well within her reach, and also one of the cleanest, shiniest items in the little shack. Her 5-year-old legs took her to it without even really thinking. It was so bright and red and enticing. She opened it and sniffed. It smelled so good, so sweet. She took a tiny sip, and it tasted just as sweet as it smelled. In a moment, it was gone. All of a sudden, there was a sharp pain in her head, pain like she'd never felt before. Sometime later, her eyes opened and she was on her back staring at the ceiling of the little shack. And she knew. She knew everything. She knew she was Grizelda. She remembered casting the immortality spell like it was yesterday, remembered making the bright red potion to return her memories, hoping that her new young self would find it and drink it. Looking down, it took a moment to absorb that she was in the body of a 5-year-old girl, that body was hers now. But the little girl's brain was no more. Or maybe it would be more accurate to say it was so much more. She had memories of her life as Grizelda and her life as Antoinette now, which meant that she would have to pretend to be a kid as best she could from this point forth, or at least until her body grew enough that she would be accepted in society without being taken into custody and shipped off to an orphanage. Besides the obvious changes, Grizelda realized something else was different about her now too. She didn't feel the same inside somehow, not like when she was Grizelda. She couldn't really place what was different now, but something about her, besides the obvious, was just not the same. Then she remembered she lived with the LaCroix. The LaCroix of all people, did they have to be the ones to take her in? She hated them. Now they were her parents, her overbearing, over-disciplining, frustratingly, annoyingly, doting parents. It was her worst nightmare. But she did what she had to do. She went back to the old Victorian that night and pretended to be 5-year-old Antoinette. She kept the ruse up for years, but she went back to the hovel anytime she needed a break from the LaCroix or from the villagers, which was often because she didn't like people at all. The only thing any of them were good for in her estimation was to torment. Anytime one of the village kids was alone with her, she'd find ways to hurt them, mentally, physically, any way she could, really. One day, she locked one of the kids in a box the size of a small coffin, and then sat on it just to listen to him scream. Once she finally let him out, he threatened to tell on her, and she told him in no uncertain terms that he'd regret it very much if he did. He didn't listen. He told, and she got in trouble and was punished, which made her hate the LaCroix even more. She vowed to herself that she would get back at them tenfold for every perceived slight against her. She was already becoming good at getting back at people, too. Once she was allowed out again after that particular punishment, she stalked the little boy for 2 whole weeks, waiting for just the right moment. When it came, the boy and his brother were climbing some trees. She waited until he was on the ground and his brother was still up high in a tree. She walked up behind the boy, silently, startling him. He jumped. "What do you want? Go away," he said, trying to sound more confident than he was. She looked up at his brother in the tree and said, "You remember how I told you never to tell on me? That you'd regret it very much if you did?" "Yeah," the little boy said nervously, following her gaze up to his brother in the tree. Then she said, "You won't tell on me ever again after today." He turned to look back at her. She was gone, simply gone, like she disappeared into thin air. He looked around frantically for her, and he couldn't find her anywhere. All of a sudden, he heard his brother scream. A second later, his brother was on the ground in front of him, his eyes still open, but his body lifeless and visibly broken. The boy screamed and cried over his brother's dead body that day, and he never did tell on Antoinette again. Many strange things and unexplained accidents happened while Antoinette was growing up. Of course, no one could ever prove any of the occurrences were caused by Antoinette, but something made everyone feel like they were somehow. Even with no evidence of wrongdoing, everyone in the village began to fear her. And she reveled in their fear. It was easy to torment them too, because she discovered that though she could no longer do magic, not like she used to be able to anyway, her new immortal self had abilities that she didn't have as a mortal human. More and more of them came out the older she got too. She tested these abilities when she was alone, when she visited the hovel, learning her new capabilities and their limitations. She found she had amazing speed now, and strength too. By the time she was 8, she figured out that she was much stronger than every boy her age. One day they had an arm wrestling game at school where she got to break a little boy's arm and make it look like an accident. That was one of her favorite days at school ever. It almost made the multiple years of attendance of compulsory education worth it. Her speed allowed her to move so fast now that she could do things people never saw, like climb up a tree and push a boy's brother out of it while the boy was looking for her. She could move like a cat too, stealthily, even through the forest. She could move so no one ever heard her coming. Startling people quickly became a hobby. She didn't spare the LaCroix either. Not at all. She found many ways to torment them for her own amusement. Using her lightning-fast speed to move things in the house, making Claire think they had ghosts, setting lawn equipment out for Frances to trip over, causing kitchen fires so that Claire would burn herself. Antoinette played these and many other little games with the LaCroix and the village kids for years. Then, on the 12th anniversary of her casting the immortality spell, right at the exact time that she cast the spell all those years ago, her mouth began to ache. The ache turned into searing pain that seemed to rip her mouth wide open. She screamed and ran to the bathroom to look in the mirror, and what she saw startled even her. She had fangs, big, white, sharp fangs protruding from either side of her mouth. Claire had heard Antoinette scream and came running into the bathroom to see if she was all right. Antoinette turned around, the fangs gleaming menacingly. Then she saw the fear on Claire's face and couldn't help but grin. Though they'd never said it and they tried not to show it, both Claire and Frances already feared Antoinette. In fact, they were downright terrified of her, and this was too much for Claire. She saw the fangs and screamed. Then she backed away and ran into the bedroom where Frances was. Antoinette's grin turned into a smile. She could hear Claire's heartbeat from 2 rooms away now. That's new, she thought to herself, and she liked it. She could hear Claire frantically telling Francis and Francis's initial disbelief. Yet even though his mind couldn't process what she told him, his heart began to race, and Antoinette could hear that as well. She could hear the blood pumping in their veins, and it called to her. A moment later, she stood in their bedroom doorway. Both of them looked at her in horror. She smiled a wide smile, showing her new fangs in all their glory. She went after Francis first, using her speed to reach him before either he or Claire could think of what to do next. She sunk her new pearly white fangs deep into his neck and tasted blood for the first time. And it was good. So very, very good. Even in her small body, it was easy to hold him steady while she drank from him, her strength already at least double or triple his. His efforts to break free were pathetic to her. After a moment, she could hear Claire turning to run. Releasing Francis unceremoniously, she moved so quickly that she was standing in front of Claire before Claire could make it out of the room. Francis's blood dripped from Antoinette's fangs as Claire stared at her in horror and disbelief, her face white as a sheet. Meanwhile, Francis, already weakened from the blood loss, struggled to get up from the floor and help Claire. Blood pulsed out of the opening in his neck, spraying all over the room with every remaining beat of his heart. Antoinette looked at Francis just to draw Claire's attention to her husband, so she could watch too. Claire tried to reach for Francis, but before she could, Antoinette struck, sinking her fangs into her, drinking deeply. Looking on wide-eyed, Francis continued to struggle to get to his wife as he held his neck in a futile effort to quell the bleeding. After a moment, Antoinette released Claire, only because she wanted to watch the blood pulse from her neck as well. She stood between them so they couldn't reach each other, but so that they could watch each other helplessly as their life's blood emptied from their bodies, knowing they were going to die. Once the life was gone from their eyes, she surveyed the scene. There was blood all over the bedroom. She couldn't even believe how much. But the best part for her was their fear, their terror. It was almost like she was giddy from it. It was her joy in that made her remember the thought that she had long ago after taking the bright red potion. She remembered not feeling quite like Grizelda inside, though she couldn't pinpoint what was different at the time. Now she chuckled to herself, the realization hitting her. It was so obvious, actually. The darkness was inside her, the evil her old friend and mentor had warned her about. She knew that should bother her, too. A part of her knew that Grizelda would have been upset by this revelation, and especially upset by the bloody scene before her. But she was no longer Grizelda. She was Antoinette now. Antoinette the Immortal. She was also something more, something very powerful that she didn't yet understand, but that she already knew she was going to enjoy very much. The end. Now, those of you who've watched my Cobweb Cafe video and already heard the Legend of the LaCroix story know that it's not really entirely the end. You know that Antoinette was not seen again for many, many years after the LaCroix were murdered. What you don't know is that when she finally returned over a century later, she moved into Grizelda's old hovel, spruced it up a tad, and added a multi-floor basement, with the bottommost floor being her coffin, her bedroom. Yeah, that's it. So both Grizelda's hovel and Antoinette's not-so-tiny vamp house will be on the gallery under my EAID Crystal Gamer 1. Grizelda will also be out there along with the adult version of Antoinette, whose CAS footage, unfortunately, I did not have for this video. You can see her here in her somewhat upgraded version of Grizelda's little shack, though. And so that's it for today, and I hope you guys enjoyed this story. If you did, definitely don't forget to hit that like button below, and if you're not yet subscribed, definitely subscribe, hit the little bell for notifications, and thank y'all so much for spending the time with me today. Hope to see y'all back again next time. Bye now.